Yozma, the match. The first acquisition of an Israeli startup by a European company was Siemens. Definitely a milestone. Since then, Europeans have invested hundreds of millions of euros in Israel. And it's all been made possible by a government program called Yozma, a Hebrew word meaning initiative. Meet Orna Berry, chair of the Israel Venture Association, aka the Innovation Czar. Thanks to her and Yozma, we now have Ornet Data, which is responsible for the development of LANs, or local area networks, which multiplied bandwidth 50 times. Pretty impressive. The office of Ornet Data, Carmiel in northern Israel, which started with only a handful of employees. In those days, there was no mechanism for early stage, high risk funding. VC, or venture capital, we need to point out, is defined as investment funding precisely for high growth tech companies. In other words, it takes shekels to make shekels. But investors were basically spooked by the first intifada in the late 1980s. Not surprisingly, venture capital took a major hit, and new strategies for attracting venture capital had to be developed. It's important to point out that the role of the venture capitalist basically amounts to mentoring. It's a lot more than just writing a check and walking away. Nor is it enough just to develop technologies. One has to think globally. In other words, marketing. Israel ended up developing two sources of funding. One was the OCS, or Office of the Chief Scientist, providing matching grants. But the OCS couldn't raise follow-on capital to market the products that were developed. Big problem. The second source became known as BIRD grants, which stands for Binational Industrial Research and Development. The BIRD Foundation created an endowment for U.S.-Israeli business ventures. But the foundation, the BIRD Foundation, didn't fund anything until Ed Milavsky became executive director. Ed so much loved Israeli openness that over time he actually decided to move to Israel. Another way to think of BIRD is as sort of a dating service, marrying Israeli tech companies and American marketing companies. The good news is the matchmaker subsidizes the cost. Half of the money goes to the American company, the other half to the Israeli company. And that basically amounts to a shortcut to American markets. The reality is, without BIRD, companies would be reduced to bootstrapping. basically collecting personal funds, milking personal connections, and so on. Not an easy task. In 1991, the Israeli government funded some 24 new technology incubators. It provided funding specifically for Russian scientists for research and development. The overarching goal was pretty clear: to find out whether a particular product can be commercialized. Can you sell it? That's the question. But government financiers couldn't turn R&D into a commercial success. A private venture capital industry was needed. Now, venture capital is a very important source of funding for startups and small businesses that don't have access to capital markets. As part of the Israeli startup ecosystem, venture capital is institutionalized in the sense that it's done by professional organizations focused on investing in startups. These firms, in turn, have to report to their own investors and work to provide a positive return for them. Before they make a single investment, venture capital firms, VCs, raise investment funds from accredited investors and from other asset managers. These funds have specific mandates, rules, and frameworks that define the types of startup investments they make. These mandates can be sector specific, like a biotech fund, or focused on maturity, such as late stage startups, or follow general investment criteria. Enter Yozma initiative. As Orna Berry put it, before Yozma, the equivalent of Elvis, there was nothing. And here's how it worked. The Israeli government invests $100 million for 10 VC funds. Each fund has to have 3 parties: Israeli venture capitalists in training, a foreign VC firm, and an Israeli investment company. It's all based on a 1.5 to 1 match. For example, if the Israeli company raised $12 million, the government would give $8 million. But there was something else unique about this government program. It was to disappear once it served its purpose. That's pretty astonishing. Recall that the late Ronald Reagan once said, "The closest thing on this earth to eternal life is a government program." In the case of Yozma, it amounted to a built-in get in and get out. Pretty rare in today's world. Government would be the catalyst, an example being Gemini Israel funds. In 1993, it contributed $1 million to Ornet Data. Walden Venture Capital was brought in as an investor. From 1992 to 1997, 10 Yozma funds raised some $200 million. A match sparked fire. The results? Pretty impressive. ESC Medical, focused on lasers. The Galileo semiconductor firm. Common Touch, involved with email and messaging. And Jacaranda, building online workspaces. Then there are seed funds. Those are the riskiest, involving a one-to-one match. Israel's own version of Silicon Valley, Wadi Ventures, has launched a new microseed VC fund. Seed funds became a real buzz in the US VC community. In 1994, Israel Seed Partners was born without a matching grant. And Israel Seed Partners in turn grew into 45 Israeli VC funds. The program was so successful that representatives from Japan, South Korea, Canada, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Russia came to Israel to meet the founders of Yozma. In 2008, Ireland created an innovation fund, basically copying Yozma. In any case, Europe has generally been great for scientific talent, but not so great in generating startups. Yozma, by contrast, has been crucial in getting Israel into the tech boom of the 90s. Since its inception, Yozma has managed more than $170 million in its two funds, Yozma 1 and Yozma 2, and has made direct investments in more than 40 portfolio companies. Consider Israel's competitive edge in terms of total expenditure on R&D, flexibility and adaptability, entrepreneurship of managers, availability of scientists and engineers, venture capital availability, and information technology skills. Out of 131 countries, Israel ranks 17. But in 2000, the great tech bubble burst. The Oslo peace process also blew up, and the Israeli economy was hit by recession. Surprisingly enough, Israel's startups adapted and actually rebounded. But Israeli capital markets were constrained, and financial services were inhibited. The problem? Government regulation. It was illegal to change performance fees or to charge performance fees until 2005. And then along came Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's finance minister at the time, who in 2003 cut taxes, transfer payments, public employee wages, and 4,000 government jobs. He also privatized El Al Airlines, Israel's national airline, the national telecom company, Bezik, and ushered in financial sector reforms. Bibi could actually be considered a revolutionary of sorts because he tackled the stifling role of government on the economy. His reform was to change the mindset of the government. His revolution was to change the mindset of the country. He remarked that the private economy is like a thin man carrying a fat man on his back. His reforms were met with nationwide strikes by labor unions, but increasing public support. He also pushed banking sector reforms, including a phase-out of government bonds yielding a 6% return. With that kind of interest rate, 6%, there was no initiative to invest in anything else. The result? $300 million a month, thanks to these reforms, were released to be invested elsewhere. Today in Israel, firms charge performance fees. As a result, KCPS, an asset management firm, was founded. Because of Netanyahu's financial sector reforms, it also became legal for investment managers to charge performance fees. Tal Kenan didn't waste any time. He founded KCPS, Israel's first full-spectrum financial asset management firm, in Tel Aviv and New York. The moment I read the draft law of Bibi's reforms, my wheels started turning, Kenan said. It was clear that this truly could liberate our non-high-tech economy. The idea was to utilize military talent, using algorithms for modeling macroeconomic trends. The only previous option had been high-tech. For a finance career, you had to just leave the country. There was now, however, room in Israel for such a career. And the rest is history.